Today's program is Solar Technologies and Removing Roadblocks to Implementation. In 2022, the Renewable Portfolio Standard for Maryland calls for 30.1% of the power served to consumers in the state to come from Tier 1 sources, including at least 5.5% from solar generation. This panel will examine whether or not the target is being met and address how to remove some of the real or perceived roadblocks to achieving the RPS goal. Again, this is the fourth program in the Connecting to the Energy Economy speaker series, and it's made possible by the sponsors that are shown on your screen. We want to just take a quick moment to highlight our voltage sponsors. BGE is a longtime supporter and partner of MCEC. We also welcome new sponsor this year, Schneider Electric. Siemens Industries has come forth once again. They spoke last week on shifting to a zero emissions fleet and will be in a later program. And then also we want to give special thanks to our returning power sponsor, Cohn Resnick, an award-winning advisory assurance and tax firm with headquarters in Bethesda. They have been our series sponsor since we started this. Once again, we have a great program today and a really dynamic panel. Once our speakers' bios are available online at www.mdcleanenergy.org/solar-tech/. Now I would like to introduce today's moderator, Stephanie Johnson. She is the Executive Director for CHESA. Stephanie, thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you for having me. Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie Johnson. I'm the Executive Director of the Chesapeake Solar and Storage Association, and I'm very excited to be here to discuss the current solar landscape in Maryland with all of you today. So as many of you know, Maryland is behind in reaching its RPS goals, specifically in reaching its solar carve-out goals. So I wanted to touch on a few issues that the industry has experienced here in Maryland that you might not be aware of. So first of all, we're very, very lucky in Maryland to have so many clean energy advocates and so many solar supporters within the environmental community, within the government, within the legislature. And we really appreciate all of your support over the years. And I want to stress that. So since 2020, we've experienced a downturn in how much solar that we've been able to deploy. And there are a few issues that we did not anticipate, such as the COVID 2020 pandemic, and then the supply chain issues that resulted from that. And that really limited our ability to deploy solar at the rate that we had previously thought that we could. But there are a few other issues that we haven't really dove into previously. In particular, the ability of us to deploy ground mount solar. So in order to meet the RPS goals, we will have to have ground mount solar in the form of either utility scale solar or community solar. And I think there's still a lot of barriers when it comes to local communities understanding, the value of solar, what it means for their community, what it means for the rollout of clean energy. And so I'm excited today to have some of our panelists who will be able to discuss that more in depth. And I think from my end, that's all I really wanted to stress for the RPS goals. And I think we can move over to Cindy McCabe. She's the Associate Director of Renewable Energy at the Montgomery County Green Bank. Hi, Cindy.
Hi, Stephanie. Thank you. And good morning, everyone. I will jump right in here. I'm working with the Montgomery County Green Bank. And so I've prepared a quick intro to green banks and to solar. Many of you on the line I know already are very familiar with solar, probably more than I am. And so I'll just be very brief in case there are any newcomers to renewable energy joining us today. You can go to the next slide, please. Here's a quick agenda for what we'll go through. As I mentioned, we'll talk about what a green bank is, since lots of folks don't know. A brief intro to how solar could be installed and financed, and then what the roadblocks are that we see in financing and how we address those. You can go to the next slide. You can see on the map here that there are lots of green banks around the area. The Maryland Clean Energy Center is one, the DC Green Bank is another, We've got a few different green banks right here in the state of Maryland as well. And they're just spreading and spreading with the funding that was announced with the Inflation Reduction Act as well. They're basically not banks in the sense of going and taking out an account, taking out a deposit, but a financing entity to finance solar, other clean energy, and to fight climate change. You can go to the next slide, please. On the bottom of this slide are some of the stats for my green bank. But just briefly to let you know about the Montgomery County Green Bank, we are an independent 501c3, and we help finance renewable energy projects and energy efficiency projects that may not otherwise happen due to perceived risk by the local banks and credit unions. Go to the next slide, please. All right, so let's talk quickly about different ways that solar can be designed and connected for residents and businesses. On the left side here in green is net metered solar for residents and commercial businesses. And then we'll talk about community solar as well. Net metered solar can be installed on a home or business, rooftop, ground mount, or canopy style. I won't get too much into the different pricing for rooftop, ground mount, or canopy, but they're kind of in order of pricing. So rooftop being the least expensive because the structure is already there. If the roof is in good condition, perfect, that's the most economic as well. And then ground mounts increases the price a bit, canopy more than that. A net metered solar system generates power for the home or business. The solar system is connected to the main electric panel or possibly more than one electric panel and offsets demand on the grid. So it's important to know that this is a grid tied solar system and it can be owned or rented. And we'll get into financing a little bit later. Well, now we'll move over to community solar, which is available for commercial only. That'll be built by a solar developer or installer. And it is all connected to the grid, not connected to the property. And all of the electricity is counted by the utility. And then subscriptions are offered to residents or businesses, depending upon the subscription types, to get electricity, usually at a rate that's lower than what the property is paying at the time. And that goes to the developer. The subscriber will get a credit on their utility bill for the amount of power that they get from their allotment of the solar array. You can go to the next slide, please. All right, this slide talks a little bit about net metering with battery backup. I just want to mention that most solar systems that you see don't have battery backup. And so when the sun goes down, the property will pull electricity from the grid. And you can see the grid signified on the right side of this picture. This solar system is showing you if there was a battery, that the solar would go during the day, the solar energy would go through the inverter and fill up the battery. And then when it turns to night, the battery power would get pulled back into the home. That's one way to set up a battery. There are different ways. But I also would just want to note for everybody that there is more equipment than just the solar panels on the roof. It's important to know. And for homes that or businesses that don't have battery backup and just solar, if there's a power outage, the solar system will turn off for safety reasons. So it's important to know that if anyone is not familiar. You can go to the next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about how a net metered solar system is built. An installer or developer will take a look at your bills, how much energy you use in a year, a month, throughout the year. You can see here on the right, that's an example of usage throughout the year. It changes depending upon the seasons and what's pulling electricity inside your home. A net metered system will offset a certain percentage of your usage, sometimes more, sometimes less. I usually call it a chunk of your usage. And things that the installers will take into consideration are the roof orientation, if it's roof installed, or it could be ground or canopy as well, and the coding requirements for where you live. You can go to the next slide, please. On the other side, as I mentioned, is community solar. That's built in one utility territory. So if it's the solar system is built, for example, in PEPCO territory, then users of another utility would not be able to subscribe to that. Usually it's built by a third-party owner, an installer or a developer. It's sold out as in subscriptions, as I mentioned, and the customer gets both credits and they get paid for the subscription, usually at a lower price than what they're paying now. You can go to the next slide. So let's switch over quickly and talk about the incentives. So now we're getting into financing a little bit. So there are various incentives available for solar right now. The first one on the left, and the largest one being the federal tax credit. Things just changed with the IRA, or the Inflation Reduction Act. For the federal tax credit, also known as the ITC, the owner of the solar system takes the credit when they're filing taxes for the year that the system was installed, and it reduces the amount of taxes owed. We always say to consult your accountant for tax liability if you're not sure how much you owe in taxes, or if you owe taxes. Since the IRA passed, the amount of the ITC is now 30%, although we are waiting for guidelines from the IRS. That should say IRS, excuse me. We'll move to the next one, which is solar renewable energy credits, or SRECs. Sorry, come back to the previous slide for me. So we can talk about SRECs real quick. SRECs are part of a carbon offset market to help the utilities meet their RPS standards, which is what Kathy was speaking about earlier. SRECs are generated as the system generates clean energy. One credit I looked recently was about $59 in Maryland. The SRECs are worth very different amounts depending upon what state they're sold in. So there are parts of Maryland that are connected to the DC credit zone, or the feeder. Those are worth a lot more. So make sure that you know what state your credits will be sold in. The market can fluctuate, and the program is not really unending, so it could terminate with legislation. Maryland offers a rebate of $1,000 or more depending upon the size of the solar system, and that's subject to availability. Okay, now you can go to the next slide, please. So let's talk quickly about the IRA. This is in no way a full summary of the IRA. It's over 700 pages long. So this is just key points that we've pulled out. Again, subject to IRS guidance that should be coming out later in the year. I mentioned already that the amount of the tax credit is now 30% retroactive to systems that were installed and put in service this year. Starting next year, there will be direct pay options for nonprofits. There are some specifications there for the type of nonprofit, and a direct transfer of credit will be available in 2023 again. We're waiting for more guidance on that. There are some adders available that could raise the full value of the ITC up to 60% if all of the adders are included. And those include US made content, low to moderate income components of the project being in energy areas as well. For battery storage, battery backup, as I mentioned, not all solar systems have this, but the tax credit for the battery portion is now 30% as well. And then for larger solar systems, or solar systems that are commercial and over 1 megawatt, there is a prevailing wage where the contractors must pay a certain wage to their employees based on the area median income in order to qualify for the ITC. So again, this is just a quick summary, not exhaustive. You can go to the next slide, please. So now we're going to switch into different options for financing solar. Basically, ownership versus renting is an easy way to think about it. For ownership, the homeowner or business owner pays for the solar system either on their own or with financing. If they're financing, usually predictable monthly payments are available without any upfront payment. At least that's what a lot of the green banks offer. And the homeowner or business owner insures the solar system under their insurance policy and maintains it if it's outside of any kind of warranty that comes with the solar system. The incentives are available for owners as well. If you're thinking about not owning a solar system, there are rental options available. The homeowner or business owner can sign what's called a power purchase agreement or PPA or a lease. A lot of those are 20 to 25 years. And in that case, another entity, a third party, like a solar installer or developer, will own, install, manage, and insure the solar system. They will also take the incentives. So that's important to know. And that'll bring down the end price that comes to the renter or the homeowner or business owner. You can go to the next slide, please. So now we're at our last two slides. What are the roadblocks and how do we bridge them? So let's talk quickly about roadblocks specifically to solar financing. The first one being that nonprofits or for-profits that are lacking income can miss out on all or some of the ITC. That at least was before the Inflation Reduction Act announced a direct pay option earlier this year, as I mentioned. We're eagerly awaiting guidance from the IRS on how this will work, how this will be taken, and it will be a game changer in solar financing. However, one thing to keep into account is that if the nonprofit can get the 30% ITC, they still need to finance the rest of the solar project, whether that's out of pocket with a loan or with a rental agreement. The ITC will only still cover 30% of the total cost. So they would have to think about if they want to take out a loan, they want to sign a third-party agreement, and how that will work. Also, the owner of the solar system is able to take the ITC. So if they do not choose to own the solar system, they still would not qualify for the direct pay. Anyone thinking about this can talk to any of our green banks. We also provide advice and education. So for the next roadblock, upfront capital, that's a big roadblock for a lot of people. And a lot of people assume that they need to have a lot of money in order to get a solar system. There's also risk associated with putting money up front, and we understand that. On the next slide, we'll talk about how we bridge all of these roadblocks. The next roadblock being the SREC market and its unpredictability past about 5 years out or so. So those are the solar renewable energy credits that we mentioned, digital credits that are sold on the market that the owner of a solar system will earn as their solar system produces electricity. The SREC market was created so that companies that might pollute the environment can pay for that pollution with a carbon offset. Most quotes for solar will include an estimate for how much the SRECs are worth. However, it's very unpredictable and it's hard to determine after 5 years. So we'll talk a little bit about how we bridge that as well. The last roadblock being credit qualifications and credit risk. There are a couple different roadblocks connected to credit score and qualifications. First, many folks and businesses don't know how credit works or what their credit score is. Knowledge is power in this area. It's important to know your credit and what's on your credit report so you know your buying and lending power. And also you can avoid identity theft. There are also debt included in credit qualifications. So if you have a mortgage, if you have other debt, it's important to know how your debt changes your credit and what amount of money you can borrow. You can talk to a financial advisor about that. You can go to the next slide. This will be my last one. So how do we bridge these roadblocks to solar financing? The first way is that we offer lots of options that don't require any upfront payment. All of the options through our green bank don't require any upfront payment, although you can make one if you'd like your monthly payments in the long term to be lower. This really opens doors to solar. Not only do you not have to have money down to get a solar system, but most of the financing options allow you to start saving money as soon as your first bill, if you'd like. There's also long-term return on investment available depending upon which option you choose. And your solar developer or installer can advise you on which option will save you the most money upfront or long-term. There are rental agreements available, as I mentioned, PPAs and community solar roof leases. A PPA, I'm sure everyone already knows, allows you to pay a little bit less for your electricity than what you're paying now. Imagine if you could set the price for other things in your life for the next 20 to 25 years, the price of gas, the price like gasoline, for example, that's the biggest one, or interest rates, which keep going up. On the other hand, community solar roof leases allow you to rent your roof essentially, or another part of your property to a solar developer or installer and not have any charge for that. You just get a payment from the installer or developer. So I'll say that again, that's a way to not have a bill for that solar and get income from it. We use experienced solar developers, and all green banks usually have contractors and developers that they trust. Flexible loan terms. So depending upon how fast you'd like to pay off a loan, you can look at a loan that would be paid off in 2 to 5 years or up to 20 or more years. I know the DC Green Bank just started a loan program that's 25 or maybe even 30 years now, and we're looking at that as well. So the longer the term, the lower your monthly payment will be. Again, it depends upon if your goal is to pay the loan off quickly or to have lower monthly payments. We also have tailored approaches. That just means if what green banks currently have aren't working for you, they're not exactly what you want, most green banks will talk to you about what it is you do want and how they can meet your goals in that way. And last but not least, project assistance. So most green banks have folks that can help you understand the renewable energy market, how renewable energy works, and again, connect you with trusted contractors and developers in that sector. You can go to the last slide. And that's just my contact information if you have any questions. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Cindy. So I had a few questions. My first question was, how do you think we can better utilize green banks to increase the deployment of behind the meter solar?
Sure. So how can we, we're doing it right now. So basically we're financing community solar systems. We're financing net metering systems. So basically I would say that the best way to utilize the green bank is to make sure folks know about them. So what we do is we try to speak on presentations like this or other community groups, for example, the county food councils and things like that, to get the word out, because most people don't know that our options are even available. But once you get hooked up with someone from a green bank, they'll take it from there. You really don't have to do too much.
Great. Thank you, Cindy. So we have a question from Paul Richards. He asks, is there a minimum system size for green bank PPA on a commercial opportunity?
There isn't. That's a wonderful question. So some of our developers do have minimum system sizes, but we have 2 that do not. The 2 of our developers do not have minimum system sizes, so please reach out.
Great. And does anyone else have any questions for Cindy? Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Cindy. That was very informative. We really appreciate your work. So next we'll be moving on to Adam Tabitsky. He's the Consulting Director of State Relations with the Land and Liberty Coalition. Hi, Adam.
Hey, good morning, Stephanie. Good morning, everyone. Lot to cover. It's been dark and stormy for 5 days, and I've got 10 minutes to sell everybody on solar panels for ag land. So I'll dive right into it. Next slide, please. Land and Liberty Coalition. We're active in 13 states. We're a nonprofit. We focus mainly on utility scale solar. We do some wind, community solar, and also transmission. Almost all the work we do is at the county level, building initial awareness among stakeholders and county officials, local residents. And we work from the very beginning process of explaining the benefits of these systems all the way through siting to project specific advocacy. Our work, our backgrounds are in government relations, political consulting, political communications, setting up coalitions, public-private partnerships, and the land liberty work we do direct engagement with local officials. We do not lobby at the state level. grassroots advocacy, media relations, and we also testify before local county panels and also the PSC. Next slide, please. We bring a free market conservative perspective to this. We are a project of the Conservatives for Clean Energy. We are not a greenwashing group. That's important to point out. We're not here to help conservatives and Republicans look good. We're here to help them to understand the benefits of clean energy and these programs. Our focus is on landowner rights, farmers' rights, preserving ag land for the next generation, creating jobs, American energy independence, which is increasingly important over the last 6 months or so. And I think what all of us believe is that we follow the science, the facts, and the data. We think it's far more helpful than thoughts and feelings when it comes to educating people and moving forward on these important greenhouse gas reduction goals. Next slide, please. Stephanie got into the challenges. They are acute. Maryland is very far behind in terms of meeting our solar targets. The PSC estimates we'll need about 6,200 megawatts of solar to meet our targets. We're on track to do about 1,600 megawatts by the end of next year. And that means we're going to need about 570 megawatts of new solar generation each year before 2030. According to the industry, we're on track to do only about 210 megawatts a year. So we have to not only get these projects done, but also add a lot more to them. Next slide, please. Why do we focus on rural? And the main reason is that's where the opportunities are and that's where the land is. The opportunities are often not very well known. For farm families that choose to lease their land to a developer for 25, 30 years, they get a stable income for that period. They don't have the concerns anymore of fluctuating fuel, fertilizer, labor costs that have gone wildly up and down just over the last year and during the pandemic. And also they don't have to be concerned about floods or droughts. For the farm families that choose to sell to a developer, they get fair value for their land. And for the counties, and this is where a lot of our work is, they get more tax revenue than they would from a traditional solar crop alone, without all the costs associated with residential and commercial development. And one of the things, even with counties and officials who are not necessarily for utility scale solar, they do see it as an important alternative to permanent residential or commercial development that never goes away. What we often say to people is that solar farms don't have kids, they don't commute to work, they don't take showers or get arrested, but they do help pay for the police, the sewers, the schools, and the roads that these counties often need. Next slide, please. Why the need for ag land? This has already been talked about a little bit, is that there simply isn't enough commercial, industrial, brownfields, roofs, and community solar to hit our targets. All of these are important, but you simply cannot get there with just those elements. You simply do need to have solar on rural land in order to hit these goals. Next slide. The impediments, why we're all here today. A couple of years ago, there was an important case called Washington, I believe it's Washington County Commissioners versus Perennial. And the case involved whether county officials could, at the end of the day, block a solar project from going through. And it was appealed for several years, and the Maryland Court of Appeals ruled that after the PSC gives due consideration to local zoning, local officials, local concerns, the PSC does have preeminence in terms of determining whether that project goes forward. Ever since then, especially on the Eastern Shore and in Western Maryland, counties have been scrambling to find a way around that. And most of this has come from trying to raise the costs on developers to the point where it doesn't make sense to work in their jurisdictions. Who is opposed? Often county commissioners were opposed. We also have a lot of opposition here and there from preservation groups that are concerned about the basically what the aesthetics of these projects. At the state and the county level, there is a bias in terms of what is supported as far as and what is farmed. Zoning and planning allows for growing ethanol or corn for ethanol rather, but yet it restricts planting solar for a period of time. Also, the renewable energy policies at the state and federal level are often at odds with the ag preservation policies. And what we're seeing now are attempts to use what we call sort of a tax and restrict scheme, where you'll use impose Malpf funds on solar projects, and then use those funds to put more and more ag land into preservation areas. So you're basically using today's projects to prevent tomorrow's. Next slide, please. Other things that are in the way, like in every single industry, there's infighting and there's competition. Well, even though we work to support community and we're in favor of rooftop, what we see at the county level many times is saying that, well, community solar is a far more acceptable and alternative than utility scale solar. And so in some cases, we're seeing ordinances in Delaware, where we also work, where there's preference given to community, sometimes at the expense of utility. We certainly get the competition between various companies and various industries, but again, if we're going to hit these targets for the state and for our climate, we're going to need an all of the above solution. The next thing, which Mark's going to get into, is PJM has an enormous backlog of projects right now. From what I understand, there's more projects in the PJM queue for review than there is generation within the 13-state PJM area right now. But Mark's going to get into the reform efforts and what we could be looking at in terms of a 2-year moratorium on new applications. That could potentially put anything that's filed today at about 2030 before it actually starts generating electrons. Closer to home, the PSC caseload is also enormous, and it also takes often years for them to issue a certificate of public need and convenience after the PJM and others have finished their work. We certainly agree with a lot of the environmental groups that we work with that the PSC needs more resources. We are concerned that if they're also given more mandates while we have this backlog, the problems could continue. Next slide. When you take a look at the public comments and we look at some of the opposition at the local level to solar projects, a lot of it seems to come down to perspective. I happen to have 0.42 acres of land. A lot of us live in urban or suburban areas where hundreds or thousands of tens of thousands of acres is really not conceivable to us. There was a big report that's been cited saying that essentially, if we're not careful, 28,000 plus acres of ag land is going to be consumed by, or could be consumed by solar before 2040. That sounds like a lot, especially for those of us who are used to living in suburban areas. However, we could put that exact same finding another way, which would be allowing farmers to use 1.3% of Maryland's 2 million acres of ag land for solar would help us to meet our greenhouse gas reduction targets, benefit local communities, preserve farmland, and restore ecosystems. If you're driving down the road in a rural area and one year there's corn, the next year you see solar, hopefully behind some screening, you could come to the conclusion that the farmland's going to disappear, that we're going to have increased food insecurity, but there's really no evidence of that whatsoever. There's also concerns that solar farms impact local property values. That's been researched in Maryland. It's not found to be true. Next slide, please. Concerns about ecology. We're seeing this on the Eastern Shore, and we're doing our best to debunk it. There's been claims that solar farms will harm the bay. As long as they're constructed properly, where runoff and sediment are controlled during the construction process, as is required under Maryland law, solar farms, in fact, can help save the bay. They don't need tons of fertilizer, pesticides, or millions of gallons of groundwater to operate. We also hear that, why don't we just reforest this ag land or plant regenerative agriculture? That's all important. That's part of a solution. However, it doesn't come close to the effectiveness of solar in terms of reducing greenhouse gases. Reforestation, for example, an acre of reforestation takes about 2.48 tons of CO2 out per year. solar farms, a solar acre by the same measure gets about 196 tons of CO2 out per year. Next slide, please. I'll go through this very quickly. People are concerned that solar farms destroy farmland. It's not the case. If a family or an owner of land decides to use their land for solar for 25, 30 years, what happens is the solar, it often heals the land, especially when it's paired with native pollinators, small livestock, other crops underneath the solar panels, which referred to as agrivoltaics. In fact, it makes an enormous difference in terms of what the quality of the soil, and the families are then left with land that is far more valuable afterward. And when you do have solar with pollinators, the benefits in terms of carbon removal, reducing runoff, reducing water use is profound. Next slide, please. Last slide, finally. So what can be done? We believe that we have to start working together. Conservatives, progressives, environmental groups, industry groups, and also within the industry itself. If we're cannibalizing each other, if we're pushing one solution at the expense of another, we're simply not going to meet our climate targets. For blue and green voters, what we would suggest is that the work doesn't stop once a General Assembly goes home in April. Your energy, your advocacy, your contacts, reaching out to local officials in support of these utility scale projects is important as far as getting them done. Also, working with your members at a local level on the benefits is important, and we're happy to help in that effort. With red voters, we often hear that, I'm against clean energy or I'm against green energy. What we're trying to convey simply is that this is not Nancy Pelosi, AOC, Green New Deal being foisted upon you by Annapolis and Washington, D.C. These are real benefits in these programs. In fact, when you take a look at the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, IIJA, SAGA, these benefits actually have outsized benefits to rural communities and conservative communities. And, our work, we're going to continue to try make our case with them, and any efforts and any help would be greatly appreciated. Let's turn it back over to Stephanie. Was that 10 minutes?
So my first question is that one of Chess's member companies, Arcadia, has recently partnered with the American Farmland Trust to form farmers pairing communities to work on deploying ground mount community solar projects that protect America's farmland. How can Maryland policymakers remove barriers to farmers and solar developers working together?
Yeah, good question. Most of this work takes place at the county level. Putting restrictions, raising costs either through the agricultural preserve funding, putting those costs on developers helps to push them out of the regions. What we suggest is simply educating the local communities, the local politicians on the benefits of solar, explaining that this is not something where you're all of a sudden going to run out of your prime soil as your most productive farmland, that there's a way to use a portion of it for solar for years to come, and then being able to make a decision 25, 30 years down the road, whether to use it for ag land or not. I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah. Most of these restrictions we're seeing are at the county level.
Great, thank you, Adam. And our next question, is there a requirement for solar projects on Maryland Agricultural Land Preservation Foundation easements to pay into the MALPF fund on either a flat or volumetric basis?
Yeah, there is. And that's something we're seeing in Talbot County and elsewhere on the Eastern Shore. What it comes down to is how that land is scored as far as what those funds will be. And there is an effort in a county right now that if a project comes in, I believe the number is 240 in terms of the quality of the soil, then the project might be restricted or prevented from going through. Again, preserving the farmland and putting them into agricultural preserves is an important effort. However, if the projects today are being essentially taxed to put other farms in that preserve down the road, we're simply going to not be able to meet these targets. And I can answer that more in more depth offline in terms of what we're seeing on the Eastern Shore. But all of the Malpf funding and efforts are really an effort to get around the preeminence that the PSC has established.
Great, thank you, Adam. And then another person wanted to know, how do you find land in the DC area for community solar installations?
Sure, I would definitely connect with the community solar associations and community solar groups. One of the companies that we are very familiar with is Turning Point Energy. So it's turningpointenergy.com, I believe. And on their website, they show effective uses of community solar, what the benefits are to the community. And they also, and the Community Solar Association can also point you in the right direction in terms of identifying what land may be appropriate for community solar.
Great. And Paul Richards wanted to know, are you seeing any push to include agrivoltaic requirements at the county state level in Maryland?
Yeah, we are. An important program, the University of Maryland Extension Program, is doing more and more work on agrivoltaics. And also, as the whole industry matures, not only in the US, but also around the world, there's more and more evidence and hard data on the benefits of agrivoltaics. Where, especially when it comes to protecting ecosystems, restoring native plants, bringing pollinators back. This not only benefits the farm it's on, but it also benefits the adjacent farms because of these practices.
Thank you, Adam. And we have another question. Does Maryland's RPS require that the solar carve-out is met only with facilities physically located in the state?
Great question. We were talking about it this morning. My understanding of the RPS is that it requires the energy consumed to be solar rather than in-state. However, when you talk about Maryland either meeting its responsibilities, Maryland, buying clean energy from out of state, then importing it versus being a part of the solution, I think we get back to the idea that we need to increase the in-state solar generation in order to hit those targets. And the other benefit for that, of course, is that if you're having cleaner air, cleaner water, cleaner land, you're going to disproportionately benefit communities that have been impacted by dirtier energy generation in the state.
Thank you. And then we have another question from Mr. Kevin Porter. He said, Adam, you said if a solar project filed for interconnection today, it wouldn't come online until 2030. Can you explain the math here? How did you get that figure?
Sure. So that's taking a look at the PJM queue right now, which Mark can get into. It takes a couple of years to get through that process. The siting, the local permitting, the power plant research project reviews, the environmental reviews, the PSC reviews. Once you add all of that together, you're getting into it 5+, if not 6-7 year review cycles.
Thank you, Adam. I think that's a good segue into our next panelist, Mr. Mark Sims. He's the Senior Manager of Interconnection Analysis with PJM Interconnection. Mark?
Thank you, Stephanie. Good morning. My name is Mark. I'm with PJM. As an organization, our role is, we're the NERC transmission planner and planning coordinator. So a lot of the work I'll talk about is, we've been designated this entity by NERC and backed up by FERC. We're a FERC RTO. A lot of this work are things that we have to do as well as our, companions to the north, south, and west have, similar processes where they take requests and analyze them. So in my particular group, I'm primarily involved in the technical and the analytical evaluations of the interconnection request. So we're getting a proposal. It's a certain amount of megawatts proposed at a certain point on the system with a certain technology. We'll go ahead and take a look at that. What we do is we analyze it. there's no acceptances or rejections. We just say, look, based on what the information you gave us and based on all the other customers in the queue, you either have no responsibility to, you didn't cause any problems on the transmission system, so you can build your facility and interconnect. Here's your agreement. You'll still have construction milestones and things like that, and you'll have all the permitting and all the, the non-electrical, non-PJM issues. So you'll still have to cross those hurdles. But we never reject. And then if, on the other hand, if the project causes a whole heck of a lot of problems on the system, what we'll do is give an answer and say, here's the work that you need to perform. You may need to build a new transmission line, new transformers, new stations. It may cost many millions of dollars. In some cases, it's hundreds of millions. It's been in the $1 billion ranges. But these are these projects, of course, are businesses, and they need certain amounts. So that's why we certain amounts of affordable interconnection. So I think that's part of the reason why, as we go through this, you'll see a large amount of requests, smaller amount of projects that actually go in service, because they're looking to find, like, okay, which one, as a developer, which project is viable, which one should I focus on, and then finally, when they get an agreement, they still have some headwinds to deal with. So next slide. I'll just keep going through this. I included a link here. This is a Maryland state-specific report. We do have this out on the web. There'll be a new one every year, and there's also reports for the other states in PJM. This is updated annually. Next slide. Couple things here I'll go through real quick. Overall, Maryland, this existing capacity, a lot of natural gas, about 44%. Coal, 24%, which is consistent with the remainder of PJM. Interconnection requests, solar, a big amount of requests at almost 70%. Storage at around 28%. So obviously, the development in Maryland is focused on, I would say, obviously, solar and battery, these types of, renewable resources and batteries associated with typically storing, renewable intermittent type of resources. It also mentions deactivation kind of has the potential to clear up some headroom on the system. Then there's a mention there about RTEP transmission investment, not really relevant to this conversation. Next slide. Load forecasts, load's kind of flat. That's just, so really to incorporate more generation, you almost need those, deactivations on the previous page. Otherwise, you don't, from a business point of view, economically, you can't operate more units than you instantaneously have demand for. So that, that load forecast is kind of important, but what you're seeing there with kind of the flat load growth is consistent, with the remainder of the footprint. Next slide. All right, so what do we see here in terms of, PJM as an RTO? Going around the wheel here, we'll start with coal there at around 2 o'clock. It's about 20% of the installed capacity of what we call the ICAP. Natural gas is about 44%, nuclear is about 17%, and it's downhill from there. Solar's 1,800 megawatts, about 1% of the PJM installed capacity. If we go to the next slide, in Maryland, we're about consistent with PJM as a whole. We'll start at 11 o'clock there with natural gas, 44%, coal 24%, nuclear is about 14%, and solar is less than 1% of the installed capacity in Maryland. So next slide is overall PJM queued capacities by field type. If you looked at this 5 to 10 years ago, it would have looked different. Wind would have been, wind and natural gas would have been the overwhelming pieces of the pie. Landscape has changed. Solar is obviously more than 50% of the requests out there on the system. You can see in the middle there, there's 161,000 megawatts, queued up. So there's where are we at with the installed capacity is closer to 180,000 megawatts. So the amount of megawatts in the queue is almost equal to the megawatts that are installed out there in the system. So if you can imagine from a evaluation point of view, when you study 161,000 megawatts, it's going to cause issues on the system because you're literally doubling the amount of generation that's out there. So that's part of the reason why the study process can take a bit. We have a lot of volume. We have a lot of projects that aren't successful. They drop out. We need to retool prior studies, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. I will comment if you see some things, some fuel types like nuclear, 81 megawatts. That's not a new nuclear plant that's going to be upgrade to existing nuclear plants, updating their output. All right, next slide. So Maryland and DC, what's going on here in the queue? There's about 4,200 megawatts. About 2,900 megawatts of that is solar, and that's the capacity value. The nameplate value is about 4,500. All that means is, look, it's not sunny 24 hours a day, but if it were, and the solar panels could output, their stated ability, you get 4,500 megawatts. But in reality and statistically speaking, PJM will allow 2,900 megawatts to be accounted for, and that methodology is debated and approved by PJM stakeholders. That's how we implement it. Also storage, 1,100 megawatts, along with little hydro, natural gas probably uprates, nuclear probably uprates, oil, same thing, probably updates. So obviously, lots of motivation for solar in the state, a lot going on. And what I'd like to get to over the next two slides is, what's the outcome of this? You have 4,200 megawatts in the queue currently. The next slide, we go there. This is the kind of what the queue's done over many years, not just what's currently in it. So this is a 2021 report. You can see there we have in the blue 45,000 megawatts of applications of all fuel types over the years. The green, the red, and the light blue. There's study processes we go through, and obviously as projects proceed through, we'll do a feasibility study. It's kind of a quick study, and we'll tell the projects, here's what we think the magnitude of the upgrades are going to look like. Some of them will realize that they're in a really congested part of the system, and their upgrades are way more than they could ever afford, even in the best case. They'll drop out of the process, and then the projects that don't drop out, proceed to the other studies, the impact study and the facility study. And you'll see less and less megawatts in the queue as you go along, because we're getting more specific. We're refining cost estimates. Developers are having to make decisions. But finally, I think what this group can key on there is the 10,000 megawatts in the yellow. 10,264 megawatts had agreements executed. And what that means is that PJM has said, okay, you proceeded through the study process. Any issue that's been identified, you've actually made financial commitments to mitigate those issues, and if necessary, build facilities, and they actually commit the money. There's letters of credit, there's cash, there's wires. So those projects, from a PJM point of view, we give them a signed agreement. They commit funds. They're ready to go, and this is where it gets into part of what I think Adam was talking about, and Cindy kind of touched on it. Now they're at the point where they need to make the agreement, turn it into a reality, and try to implement the project. And there's all these other issues that could come up, financing, citing permitting, public opposition, CPCNs as necessary. So the process for these customers can be a difficult one. This process can take, I'll say about 2 years, sometimes longer, depending on the complexity of the process. And then once they have that agreement, obviously there can be, years of implementation and construction and approvals, which is how somebody was mentioning, a 5-year horizon. That can really be something that you could hit 5 years, no sweat, working through these issues. So finally, out of the projects that have the ISA and the agreements, about 4,400 are under construction and about 4,000 actually went in service. So that's since the beginning of the process, which we've been implementing since about the year 2000. If we go to the final slide, just looking at solar generation, and these numbers are up to date. I just pulled these a couple of days ago. So I'd say given the amount of solar that's out on the system, I think system-wide we only have, in the ballpark of 2,000 megawatts. But there's 2,000 megawatts of solar. Actually, it's 1,774. If you look at the green bar there, I actually have my little bracket on the orange, not the green, but the green bar is, solar projects that have executed agreements. They've successfully navigated the PJM process. We've given the agreement. If they need to do any work or owe any money to the system to perform upgrades, they've provided that. So they're at the point where they need to, from a PJM perspective, they're ready to proceed. They will have construction milestones, and this is where they can get into issues with, local siting and permitting, site control. Somebody mentioned supply chain. I think, Cindy, you talked about supply chain a little bit, siting and permitting. All these other things that could come up once they go to actually, physically construct the facility. But right now in Maryland, in terms of solar generation, there's about 1,700 megawatts of solar generation that's in that status. So, that's where we're at right now. There is, we talked about what's queued in Maryland. There's a large number of queued projects. There's a large number of projects that are working their way through the impact and the facilities phase. So there may be more of these agreements being signed soon. It was brought up that the queue is going on pause. So we won't be taking for a bit any new requests, but we have a huge number of requests that have already been made that are in process that we're working on now, and we continue to work on those. We haven't stopped work on those. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot of progress in Maryland, and it's really interesting from my perspective because PJM is very focused on getting projects to this agreement phase because that's where our work starts to trail off. And that's when the work, the focus is more on the business owners to push things forward at that point. So it's very, very interesting for me to hear the perspectives of the other panelists and, the obstacles that these projects can face. That concludes my main points. I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Mark. So our first question is each individual residential system included in your PJM numbers or these system sizes estimated?
So the residential systems are, I touched on the load forecast and load growth. We have a detailed model of the system with the transmission system and all the demand, all the loads. We incorporate the rooftop solars into the base models. So it is reflected. I'll also say, rooftop solar is the type of thing where you have small amounts distributed over wide areas. So from the PJM point of view, we might have, the load for, Baltimore City there might be, 3 or 4 load centers that actually supply the entire city. And, the rooftop solars would just kind of offset the amount of demand we see at those locations.
Great. And our next question is PJM working with the federal interconnection effort?
So PJM right now is we're working on a reform process to, you see all these megawatts in the queue. We would like to see between phases, projects, if they get the signal that it's not a great location, meaning the upgrades are real expensive, they never intend to pay, and they're going to eventually drop out. We're trying to reform to get projects out so that the ones that are ready to go can move through the process quickly and efficiently and get their agreements and get constructed. There's also a NOPR out there, Notice of Public Rulemaking, that we're actively engaged with FERC as well. So there's a lot going on with the process industry-wide, and then there's some specific things happening at PJM as well.
Great. And our next question is from Mr. John Piastro. How long can a project stay in the PJM interconnection queue before energizing? What system does PJM have in place to cull the list of projects with queue space that are no longer viable and the developer no longer intends to build? Good
question. So there is a backstop. It's somewhere around seven years. That you can linger in the process. What we do is, as we issue studies, and then you have so many days. It's depending on the study, it's 30 days or 60 days to sign the agreement to move forward, or we will remove you from the process. So that generally keeps things moving. Once you do get the agreement, there'll be milestones in there. If the milestones are not met, we can breach the agreement and remove you from the process that way. But then there's also some suspension provisions. You could suspend for a year or two. So, it's a lot of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But we have things in place to keep it moving. But what I will say, with the reform package we filed, we will be much more aggressive with removing projects that are lingering and encouraging projects that are ready to move forward quickly.
Thank you, Mark. So our last question, are solar projects expedited compared with oil, coal, or natural gas, or is this a first come, first served process?
It is first come, first serve. There are some provisions to, for lack of a better word, expedite or fast track smaller projects. I believe the cutoff is below 20 megawatts, which, some solars are good, good candidates for that. Their sizes can be pretty small, pretty large. But we do have an expedited process to, in general, regardless of fuel type, to study smaller projects.
Thanks so much, Mark. So next, we are moving on to our final panelist, Mr. Robert Nicholson. He's the recycling project lead at SEIA.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me here. I think, are there any slides coming up, or? Great, thank you. So yes, my name is Robert Nicholson. I am the recycling lead at the Solar Energy Industry Association, focused on PV end-of-life issues. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about our mission. We're working to promote, develop, and implement the use of solar across the U.S. We represent over 1,000 companies and individuals across the entire spectrum of the solar industry, really focused on the 4 areas you see on the screen. My particular focus here is, again, end-of-life issues, which have recently gained a little more momentum. I think throughout the industry. We had our annual event 2 weeks ago, out in Anaheim, California, and we got a lot of feedback from our membership regarding end-of-life issues for PV. So the association made a decision this year to put some resources into developing a recycling program for our membership. So next slide, please. So the first thing we've done starting this summer is to look at the existing infrastructure here in the US from an end-of-life perspective. And there are a few things that we have found, all a result of really being somewhat early in the recycling of PV industry. But the first thing we saw was there is a lack of technology. There are recycling processes implemented here in the US, but not a lot. There's some fairly simple approach happening, whether it's the use of smelting of panels, or basically a mechanical grinding of panels to take glass into asphalt batching or concrete batching as a method of recycling. So given that it is early, there hasn't been a lot of innovation in the recycling industry yet regarding end-of-life PV. Now, that being said, there are a handful of companies that are coming into the market now with some interesting processes. So we're optimistic that we're going to start to see a change in growth in that area. But one of the things that we talk to our membership about is we really have to ask ourselves if the processes that are available, if it's an acceptable approach, if we're willing to accept smelting where a large percentage of the material ultimately ends up in landfill, if we're willing to accept those processes currently, or are we going to look for something that creates a higher yield of recoverable materials? So so that conversation continues. We're also, as I mentioned, capacity is an issue here in the US currently. The good news is we haven't seen that bow wave of end-of-life panels yet. What we're seeing now are damaged panels, returns, that type of material, looking for recycling capacity. But it's also a result of relatively inexpensive landfilling, where panels can find their way into the landfill, and compared to the recycling services that are out there currently, it's vastly cheaper, which is always going to cause, I think, panels to go in that direction. So capacity today is a bit of an issue looking forward to the amount of end-of-life panels that we expect to see over the next 2 to 5 years. So we're really driving to help the industry increase capacity. Another challenge currently is logistics. It's hard to move large quantities of panels if there's a large quantity of damaged panels in the Southwest or in the Southeast, and they need to be moved halfway across the country to get to an acceptable recycler. Obviously, that adds a lot of costs. So I'm personally working with some logistics companies, including rail companies that could provide bulking and logistics services to reduce that cost. Of course, anything over 250 miles, you can drastically reduce your cost by up to 50% by using rail. So I think there's opportunity there for us to drive costs down. And then finally, the last challenge I wanted to mention was regulatory uncertainty. And this challenge really affects not only the solar industry, but the recycling industry as well. There are many states that are having discussions now about how these end-of-life panels should be regulated. Should they be regulated as hazardous waste or universal waste or simply solid waste? That makes a big difference from a recycling perspective and a big difference from a cost perspective. So it's difficult for recyclers to have any certainty going forward when these regulatory issues are still being debated. It's difficult to allocate resources and capital if there's a chance that the regulatory landscape could change in the short term. That will require maybe relocating or new capital to make make changes. So those are the challenges we're currently seeing. If we go to the next slide, please. So for our program, we're really working through a process with the goal of having a short list of maybe 6 or 7 recyclers by the end of the year that we can make available to our membership. Certainly it'll be available to the public as well. But in doing that, the first thing we're doing is identifying recyclers here in the US. There are a lot of companies that advertise recycling services of all things, including solar. But we're trying to find recyclers that have a dedicated process to the panels and transparent downstreams where the material is going. There's also new companies now entering the space that we feel are very important to the overall landscape, and that's companies that I call asset management companies who are looking to find value in end-of-life panels that can be refurbished or repaired and then taken into different markets, and keeping those panels out of the waste stream, at least until they truly have no value left. So in our mind, we want to have a list of recyclers, and next to that, a list of asset recovery companies that will get these panels first, conduct some form of triage, collect the panels that have value that can go back into the market, and then send the truly end-of-life panels down the line to the recyclers. So we want to pair those industries up, and in some cases there are recyclers who are also refurbishment and asset recovery companies, and that's fine. We think that's a good combination, so we'll include them in our assessment. And then lastly, again, logistics providers. We're working with some companies that are going to specialize in moving the panels to the asset managers and recyclers to make sure they do it in a compliant, in cost-effective way. So our process to do this is basically a vetting process where I'm going out and visiting and conducting audits at the participating recycling facilities. The things we're looking at right now are things like, from a regulatory perspective, what permitting is in place. In some states, there are no permitting requirements. In others, they're a little more stringent. We're trying to build a database of these recyclers and what permitting processes they've gone through, in talking to state regulators to better understand what the permitting requirements might be going forward for those recyclers and any other recyclers that move into the state. We're also looking closely at the markets, the downstream markets that recyclers utilize, and asking them to provide us with mass balance accounting so we can fully understand where this material is going. The panels are about 80% glass. So at the end of the day, we'd like to understand where that glass is going and how it's being deployed to ensure that we're using acceptable recycling practices. And we're also looking at insurance. And again, this is our job is to remove uncertainties for our membership. So not only do we want to make sure the recyclers that we're promoting are fully permitted when it's necessary, but we want to make sure that the recyclers carry an appropriate amount of insurance to reduce liability on a membership side. So that's taking place now. I'm actually traveling to see these recyclers. That process will be done in early December, and then we will launch and promote our updated list of these recyclers, and we'll have their compliance data. Ultimate goal here is simply to create a list of cost-effective, compliant recyclers here in the US for our membership.
Thank you, Robert.
Sure.
So our first question is, does SIA have template language for regulatory policies that could be shared as a good starting point for local decision makers to reference?
We do. We're working on that now. We have a number of people in our policy group that working with our membership in different states, we're developing that language now. And really our focus right now is to provide consistent guidance, which is difficult with over 1,000 members. You know, the membership, everybody, a lot of members have different opinions and viewpoints, which is okay. But we're currently pulling that all together now to draft that language that we think we can move consistently across the US.
Great. And do you have any final thoughts about what you wish that local policymakers understood about solar decommissioning?
I think that what needs to be understood right now is the lack of capacity. The capacity needs to be addressed for any of the plant decommissioning or regulatory issues that are arriving regarding how the material is classified. Or there are some states talking about things like producer responsibility for taking back these panels and getting them to recycle. That's all great, but the challenge really is capacity. It's almost putting the cart before the horse a little bit to create programs yet not have the capacity to deal with the material.
Great, thank you. And let's see, we were going to have Bob, but we think that Bob has fallen off again. So let's see if we have any other questions. John Fiastro is asking what companies are doing or talking about doing at this scale.
I'm sorry, what recycling companies are talking about doing?
Yes, recycling companies.
Well, there are new processes entering the marketplace that one that I've been talking to recently, an overseas manufacturer of recycling equipment that has a system that a full-time operation would process about 150,000 panels per year. If that's what the question means, at what scale, that's what I'm seeing right now, which when you really look at the broader landscape of EV projects, that's a very small number. Again, speaks to the capacity issue, but there are a couple of new recyclers in the country now that have much greater capacity. I just haven't visited them yet. I'll see them over the next 30 days to better understand what that capacity is. It'll be a much bigger numbers, but the automated equipment manufacturers that are entering the space, that 150,000 number seems to be fairly consistent.
Thank you, Robert. So I think that is all the questions we have for today. So I want to thank all of our panelists, Cindy, Adam, Mark, and Robert, for answering all of our questions and giving us such a good overview of the barriers and the roadblocks that we're facing in Maryland when it comes to solar deployment. And I appreciate everyone who's attending and keeping an open dialogue. This is super important that we work together to remove these roadblocks and to actually be able to meet our RPS goals. And I feel like we're making a lot of progress, and I'm very encouraged, and I'm really excited to see what happens with the IRA passage in terms of incentivizing solar deployment. But I would like to highlight that without ground mount solar, we will not be able to meet our RPS goals. So working with the Land and Liberty Coalition, working with local farmers and solar developers to figure out a plan to go forward is key and top of mind for my members and for Chesa. So thank you very much. And Kathy, do you have any closing remarks?
Sure, Stephanie, I just have one more question that I wanted to throw at Mark Sims. Residential solar has a clear start date and connection process. Does PJM consider or plan for future decommissioning in terms of load served? Is that part of the thinking?
Is the context of future decommissioning existing larger generation? And if it is, we do plan for that. But the tariff does say that the owner of the generation that's being retired, they have 1 year after it actually retires to re-enter the interconnection queue and claim those rights, which typically does does happen. So it does, there is a preservation period there. It doesn't go back, it doesn't go back to the system right away, but it also doesn't linger there forever.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. What a fabulous panel. You all covered a lot today. Everybody brought to the table something really relevant to this discussion, and this is not an easy thing to do. And we're grateful for your time and your expertise. I want to thank our audience for joining us today. As you exit the webinar, please take a moment to answer a couple questions and share your feedback to help MCEC plan for future programs and educational content. You'll see questions pop up on your screen. As a reminder, the recordings from this series will be posted online at www.mdcleanenergy.org/speaker-series. We really hope you'll join us again for our upcoming programs. On October 11th, we'll be focusing on environmental justice in the energy sector. I have a fabulous panel lined up for that. It's a rainy day out there. We hope you all will stay dry, and we look forward to seeing you at future Connecting to the Energy Economy Speaker Series programs. Bye, everyone.